Good morning, everybody. My name's Toni McInnes. I'm the Director of Housing from National Disability Insurance Agency. I work in the National Office, which is located in Geelong, Victoria. Again, thank you to my counterparts in ACT Government for inviting me here to speak this morning. And thank you to the Minister also for her very warm welcome and introduction. This morning I'm going to talk specifically about the NDIA's role in housing, in supporting people who are participants of the National Disability Insurance Scheme in how they can be supported to live more independently. I think the Minister also got the morning off to the right note when she talked about us being collaborators, in that we are all contributors to the outcomes that we're seeking to achieve, and certainly there's a lot of expectation about what the NDIA can provide to people. Click. So I first want to take the opportunity to talk about what types of supports that we talk about within the scheme about people living more independently. So that can mean the range of supports that a person needs, whether that's within their own home or whether they want to live more independently in the community, sometimes because it's a natural life transition point where they're now adults, and like many other young adults, they want to look at moving away from the family home. So some of those supports look like things like capacity building up the skills to live more independently. So sometimes within the family context, there's a lot of support provided by the family, and as a result, people don't develop those skills as easily as some other people to live more independently. So we would look at funding capacity building as a first step. We also look at the use of assistive technology that will enable people to be more independent in some of the day-to-day activities that they undertake. We'd also look at things like home modifications, which would allow them to sustain the housing they're in, so live with their families for longer, or being able to live more independently in another environment of their choosing. Those things combined often will be enough for some people with a disability to actually be able to live quite satisfactorily in the community. I do take note about the availability and affordability of housing in the ACT. I have worked in the ACT for quite a while before moving to this role, so I'm kind of aware of some of those issues, so it's not like they don't exist, but again, it's that collaborative effort through various different points of intersection that is going to resolve this issue in the medium to longer term. The last support that the NDIS will fund is called Specialist Disability Accommodation. It's really important that people think about specialist disability accommodation as a support that the NDIS will fund. It's very easy to go to, this is housing for people with a disability, and I need to make it really clear that that's not the actual context of why the NDIS would fund it. The NDIS funds specialist disability accommodation on the basis that a person has, I should be clicking, sorry, forgot that bit, that a person has either an extreme functional impairment and or very high support needs, and for the most effective way for their support needs to be met is in an environment where sometimes there's a level of physical modification, or it allows for those supports to be delivered in a safe and effective manner. So that might be because, for example, they need 24-hour care. They need staff on site for their own safety or the safety of the other people in the house to ensure that their lives are, as ordinary as possible. But that doesn't actually happen so easily in a lot of the accommodation that's available. So if there's not enough space for people to be able to have staff on site, or to be able to move their power wheelchair, for example, around their property, then we start looking at SDA as a funded support that will support the other NDIS funded supports. So it sounds like a bit of a loop, but it's about the process that we would follow to get to that point. As you heard me mention, people with extreme functional impairment or very high support needs. So that is a particular group of participants within the scheme. It's estimated to be about 6% of the group of all the participants who will come into the NDIS. And there's a reason behind why we've kind of estimated those numbers. It's not a cap. We don't say, for the person who's next in line, we say, no, sorry, there's no funding for that. That's an estimation because of the way that we've kind of done the modelling, and we had to come up with, for our actuaries, an estimation of that. And there is legislation, the SDA rules, that outline the eligibility for participants, but also how people can be providers of SDA, and also how they enrol the dwellings. There's two parts to SDA. One is the funding that we will put into a participant's plan. The other part is that the NDIS, through the payment of provision of that support, want high quality fit for purpose dwellings to be used for the provision of SDA. We want to lift the bar. We have lifted the bar. We have legislation that lifts the bar. We also have policies that lift the bar that say these buildings have to be at least at this level before we will pay you as an SDA provider to deliver that support to people. So you can't take an ordinary house in the suburbs, put a ramp out the front and turn it into SDA. We want to lift that bar. We've had numbers of decades where housing for people with disabilities has been in very short supply, and as a result, governments have absolutely done the best they can to make sure that there's as much supply as possible. But often what we've found is that people are living in, somewhat inadequate situations where people have had to adjust to living in the house that they live in, or there's more supports required within that house because of the inadequacies of the physical environment. So as part of the reform opportunity that the NDIS brings, we've lifted that bar. So we expect any new dwelling to meet a very high standard of criteria, and going forward over time, that will ensure that anybody who requires support such as SDA will have access to a fit-for-purpose dwelling rather than a make-do dwelling because they're in short supply or there's a desperate need. Click. Just to talk a little bit about the funding principles. So SDA is a significant injection into the disability housing sector, if you like, for want of a better word. As I've already talked to, there's been a long-standing gap where there's been inadequate supply, and that's often through, priorities of government having to look across the gamut of what a large group of people's needs are. $700 million per year going forward each year. Oh, somebody's arrived. Thanks for coming. So that's a significant investment that the NDIS is making in SDA, and as going back to my earlier comment, which is about lifting that bar, we're expecting that high quality and we're going to pay for it. So that's kind of the balancing part of that, and that we have the opportunity to do so. Just another thing about the funding principles, there's been lots of conversations about people living alone or on their own, or in smaller clusters. The NDIS is very aware of that, and as I said, we are prepared to look at how we can fund taking in account people's preferences. We have a number of constraints under the legislation that we also have to consider, so it can't be based on preference alone. But that doesn't mean, and certainly the policy intent is not to mean that it's a blockage for people and that they will never be able to have their preferences taken into account. So, oops, no, I'm clicking mine, not yours. As I've said, plan decisions. Everyone in this room hopefully knows that a plan decision for a participant of the NDIS is made on an individual basis. There's not a group of people who get a group of funding. Every individual person has a planning conversation, and a plan is developed to meet their particular support needs. SDA obviously can be very much a part of that conversation. We are, as I've said earlier, required to act under the NDIS Act and the SDA rules, which essentially gives us a couple of things to consider, and one being value for money. Value for money is a very interesting topic in terms of people receiving funded supports, and the terms reasonable and necessary you would have heard on a regular basis in terms of how funding is determined. So things must be both reasonable and necessary and related to the person's disability. So if I, Toni, wanted to go and live in a penthouse at Bondi Beach, which I might think was a good idea. In terms of the NDIS, for example, I would need to show that there's a reason why that would be reasonable and necessary. Do I have family who live, in close proximity to that? Are my connections in that area? Should I live alone? Probably the penthouse thing will have to come down a few levels. And what are the social economic outcomes that I would achieve by being able to have that type of support in my plan? So we're always juggling, which in the SDA space makes it quite difficult to say this will be what you'll get, this will be what you'll get, and this is what you'll get, because every circumstance is different. So we take account of the participants' preferences, we take account of the value for money, we take account of reasonable and necessary. So they're all the balls that we juggle every single time we have a conversation with a participant. I think I've covered that. Click, how's that? Did I click too far? How do I go back? Alison? Sorry.
Would you like to go forward or back?
I'd like to go backwards, thank you. I thought I had the power. So I just want to touch on a few things that we've been doing. I guess to be frank, SDA was implemented as a funded support on 1 July 2016, following a very quick flurry of activity to get it in shape for implementation. We're now 2 and a bit years in, and this year we've spent a lot of effort in, I guess, what I call ironing out the kinks, because there's kinks in the NDIS everywhere, but we are ironing out the SDA ones. So one of the first things that we were challenged with is that we needed to communicate better to the market, that is the providers, the interested developers and the financiers of SDA going forward. We've got our pricing in place that attracted the interest of those parties to increase the supply of SDA, but we were falling behind in making sure that they had sufficient and clear enough information. So we published a brief targeting both providers and financiers in April this year, and that was pretty well received, and we're intending to build on that as we go forward. We're also initiating the development of a third-party certification program. So again, from the market, they were saying to us very clearly, your instructions on what you want us to build are too light. They're too light on. We can't kind of make a good start in the design stage of the shape of what an SDA dwelling would look like in order to enrol it with the NDIS, so how we meet that criteria. So we've just contracted with Livable Housing Australia to produce what we're calling SDA standards. So they will be technical documents that will be available to the market hopefully by the middle of next year. But we're aiming for May, but I'll say middle because we're Commonwealth Government. And they will be technical specifications so that at both design stage and completion stage there can be a third-party assessment of the dwelling, that it meets the standards that we've set, and therefore it will be enrolled as an SDA dwelling. So we're taking some of that uncertainty out of the market. We're also trialling, and we've just completed a trial actually, I probably should have changed that sentence a little bit in my PowerPoint, a new way of making SDA decisions. Any of you who have been involved in that process to date, and we'll talk about the ACT planning processes in a minute, but it's a long process. It can be very complex and somewhat disheartening to people. We're trialling a process where we're taking essentially a panel approach to ensure that some senior policy makers, senior policy people, some senior service delivery people and a delegate are in the room and are able to make an SDA decision as quickly as that, pending the right amount of information that we have, and then people have the certainty of SDA in their plans to then go and start talking to the market, talking to providers, talking to developers about what their SDA budget looks like and what is possible for them to achieve in that space. At the moment, we're in a fairly, I call it a vacancy-driven process, where a vacancy becomes available and suddenly people come running into the NDI and saying, I need SDA in my plan. I need it tomorrow because the vacancy won't be held for that long, and we're not able to move that quickly. It doesn't move that quickly in the NDIA. That's the plain truth. So we're not. There's often a lot of disappointment and expectations that aren't met, and that's not good for us, the participants, their families, or the providers of SDA. So we're trying to get out in front of that, where people who are eligible for SDA get that decision as early as possible, and then at the appropriate moment they can then approach the market or talk to a provider who has a vacancy with the knowledge of what their budget contains, and therefore the assurance that should that agreement come into being, to fall into place for them, that then they'll be able to go ahead and secure that accommodation. And I guess the fallout of that is to make sure our service delivery teams have the tools and resources. SDA, being for 6% of the participants, are not always currently at the front of mind for our service delivery teams, because they have a lot of other complex matters that they have to juggle in terms of getting plans established for people. So we're working to up the resources that they have and tools that they need in order to have those housing conversations with people as early in the planning process as possible, rather than at the point where it's either a crisis or there's a vacancy that people are running into the office asking for a plan review in order to achieve an outcome. The last piece of news is that we are, and this kind of ties back to the first point, is that we're going to establish a stakeholder reference group so that we can test with a variety of people, and that will be both providers, participants, developers, financiers, our work going forward. So we've got a sounding board that's external to us. Sometimes, as you would know, Commonwealth Government particularly is accused of heads down, not looking out, not talking to the sector. And so a reference group is one of the mechanisms that we can use in order to achieve that. I think I'm nearly done. Am I?
I'll do it for you. Could you just click on the other side? Great.
You didn't say I had to click left or right. So this is my last slide. I don't want to bore you with all the text, but there is a review of the Sda Framework, which was the original document created by state and Commonwealth governments to outline the objectives of what Sda was set to achieve. DSS have just finished the consultation. Some of you may have been involved in that. They're now preparing a report for the Disability Reform Council, and from that the NDIA will be responding to those recommendations. We also made a submission to that because I think we were in an earlier conversation with the Minister where there are some unintended consequences of the rules that have bound us to certain ways of action at the moment, that we're looking at how those things can be modified to actually meet the policy intent of SDA and not constrain the market, particularly from being more innovative and more flexible in the type of SDA that people are being offered. That report is due to the Disability Reform Council in December. It's expected in December. At the moment it's on track, but we're not able to quantify when that will be. But certainly straight after that, my team is geared up to respond to whatever recommendations are agreed to. I just wanted to give you a number. And unfortunately, it's June 2018. Our next quarterly report, which would have been to 30 September, is imminent, is what they told me, but it's not public. So I can't give you even a 3 months on number. But there were 8,858 people who had SDA in their plans nationally, which leads me straight into the ACT. Many of you will know that there's a very, very low number of participants with SDA in their plan in the ACT. We, the NDIA, are working very hard with ACT government, particularly Housing ACT, to enrol their SDA accommodation with the NDIS, and subsequently to that we've got a team here in ACT ready to put the SDA funding into those participants' plans. I understand, and I think Eric from Hartley might be here, waving at Eric. Just this week we enrolled some SDA dwellings as SDA for Hartley as well, so that will be also then facilitating the funding into their plans. The funding into the plans isn't just for, and I had this conversation yesterday with Deb Fulcher, and it was really beneficial for me because the funding for SDA in the plans isn't just so that the provider can be paid, that's one part of it. Of course, the provider needs to be paid. They're providing a bricks and mortar, capital-heavy support to people with a disability, with SDA in their plan. But on the other side, we've got the participants who, with that budget, as I talked earlier, are then able to look at the market about looking for SDA that suits their needs. So it's not just about the provider being paid, but what we're trying to introduce, again, is that element of choice and control, where a participant with an SDA budget, just like our budget for physiotherapy or another sort of therapy, can go and choose which support provider they want. We want the SDA to look like that. We want that to be the shape for participants. Right now, I know we don't have that shape. We don't have the supply because, and I don't know what the vacancy rate is like in ACT properties in terms of the disability housing, but if it's consistent with the national numbers, it's almost zero. We've got less than 1% movement in supported accommodation at the moment. That's because of the supply issue. We're increasing the supply through the NDIA's tool of pricing, so we're paying a higher price for SDA properties that are brand new and meeting our criteria, so the provider will get more, but the budget for the person is also substantially increased. So we put the funding in the plan for the person to enable them to look at the range of SDA types within that budget. So it's not like everybody's condoned or confined to where they live and that's the budget that's set. We're looking at what the maximum budget we would put for each individual person, and that takes time. But what we want is people to be able to start to be like the rest of us, mobile in their housing choices. They don't have to live in that house for life. If they want to, then they can negotiate that. But for some people, it's really important to have the possibility of moving. I live in a house in Tuggeranong. All my family have moved to all their nice new houses in Gungahlin. Actually, if I could, I'd rather live in Gungahlin because their mum and dad can visit me because they're 75 and 80 years old respectively. So things like that, we expect that, we want to see that mobility across, and also obviously where the housing to date hasn't met their needs, moving into SDA where their needs will be better met.
I just have a question about one of the types of supports that you spoke about briefly, and you said it was to explore new housing options. So one of the things that myself and a number of other parents would like to do is to look at a different type of model that's not readily available. Is that something that the NDIA can assist us with when you talk about that exploring new? I'm not quite... Yes, sorry.
That's fine. Certainly the general way that we would reference that support in a plan would be what we call support coordination. So that is support for the participant, and obviously that includes their family or carers, to go and research or, obtain or look at the options that people want to explore, because obviously the principles of the scheme are ordinary life. So as much as possible, we're not actually wanting to funnel everybody in a particular direction. We are transitioning from an old style model into one that hopefully that gateway is a whole lot wider on. But it would be part of the planning conversation to say that for my person who's a participant within the scheme, we want to look at that. I'm his carer or his mum or whatever, and I can do so much, but I need some more expert help in that field. And at the same time, we're working with developing support coordinators, particularly in the housing space, who have those skills. Because there's lots of people, and there's probably many of you in this room, who can do lots of things around housing, but to date, support coordinators haven't actually twigged that, there's a bit of a specialist path for finding somebody the right kind of housing that they're interested in. So generally it would be funded as a support coordination, so that's hours that people would have put into their plan.
And we have a support coordinator presenting later in the
Oh, there you go.
Sorry, time for one more question?
An issue that's of big concern to me is permanency of tenancy. I really worried that my son will be kicked out of the house. He's got challenging behaviours, all of that sort of stuff. So Isaac, our plan is we self-manage our plan, and it's a significant one. I can't. It seems to me that the options are you get SDA, and that helps you to purchase supports from a provider of housing, but then there's the risk of not having permanency of tenancy within that housing, or if you're lucky enough to be able to purchase something yourself, but then you don't get any support to actually purchase the bricks and mortar, and it's a real struggle. So permanency of tenancy is something that I'm really concerned about, and I'm very interested to hear, what the NDIA feels about that.
I think it's a really good question probably for the Well Cafe, but I'll just touch on the tenancy issue. Again, reiterate that the NDIS is a funder of the support. We're not the provider of the supports. But where our sphere of influence comes in is that we would, we are talking to what I call the market, so the providers of SDA, about what are the benefits of long-term tenancies versus shorter tenancies of, what the standard market looks like, in terms of, the compatibility of households, so that if they've got a household that's working, the needs of the people are being met who reside there, then why wouldn't we look at a longer term tenancy? It gives surety on both sides. I guess the other thing is particularly for people who have a very complex behaviour support needs, for example, the supports that are built into the plan as best as possible look to mitigate those risks for that group of people. There's a couple of different ways we can fund supports for that, and certainly we don't want people who are considered too hard to be housed to be the ones that miss out. So we've got some strategies that we put into plans around that to ensure that providers are aware of and willing to work with that group. And it's been interesting, and because I'm in national office in Victoria, I hear some of the stuff that's going on in Victoria, and what we're starting to see are providers who actually, if you want, for want of a better word, specialise in working with people with more complex needs. And that's kind of what the market response is that we would appreciate, because that group then say, we know what we're in for here. We know that we're prepared to take on the challenge of making sure that Toni remains in her housing and has the support needs she's met, rather than there's other providers who look at a different group of people, and possibly some people say the easier end, if you like, and we're very keen to kind of grow the market in ensuring that there's a mix of providers who are providing SDA for the different groups. The other thing that we did, of course, was introduce the robust housing category into SDA, so that the risk of damage to a property, whilst we can't iron it out completely and nothing will ever happen, but where the robust category suggests that the housing is more durable, so that it's less likely to be damaged in as a result of somebody's not being able to manage their behaviour as well as some other people. And so that then again the provider isn't constantly on the train of having to repair and fix problems, which often leads to threats of eviction or eviction. So we're doing a couple of things along there, as well as generally, I think, focusing on more supports that people with more complex needs require, rather than the bog standard, you're of this type, therefore this is what you get. So for individuals, that funding will be tailored to ensure that they're getting the right amount of supports. And again, we're looking long term. We're not going to fix it tomorrow, but we're looking longer term so that people are in the right environment so that their support needs can be met. And lots of them aren't at the moment. Or they're living at home and it's about to not be able to be sustained because they've been managing it for a very long time.
So what about self-managers who do purchase their own house for their person? We don't get any assistance to do that, and I'd be very interested to learn from today is if that's my understanding, is that we don't get any assistance, but what assistance is there that exists to support people who self-manage that have purchasing a property for their child, but it's not easy. And so if I set myself up as an SDA provider, I'd get all this money, but I'm contributing to the community by funding the house myself, but I don't get any support at all for that, it seems.
I don't know that that's a question that
That's right.
Toni's necessarily going to be able to answer. So Amanda's putting some questions up on the board, and actually at the end
I think
of
it's
the
a good
session,
one
we'll actually come back to actually
to put up. I'm certainly not dismissing it.
We are really running behind time, and we are running behind time on our first session. This is not how we were meant to start.